Hello, welcome back to Peregrine Prude. I'm your rambling host, Colby Matthews. And today, as promised, we're going to begin looking at the classic Gothic novel, Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Maturin. This is kind of a dark novel, as Gothic novels are. It's kind of in the vein of Frankenstein and Dracula and Goethe's Faustus. There's a common theme with all of those, kind of a dark undercurrent in which usually somebody out of desperation, they make a deal with the devil, and it never goes well, and there's a huge adventure and everything. Often it's for like kind of an immortal existence on Earth, but they're really dead. I mean, just think about vampires, right? They're potentially eternally existent on Earth, but they have to kill other humans to remain alive, and they're basically dead. Everything in their life is an inversion of the way life really is intended to be. So I will just read the back cover real quick, just kind of give you a general idea of what this is about. In a satanic bargain, Melmoth has sold his soul in exchange for immortality, and now preys on the helpless and in their darkest moments, offering to ease their suffering if they will take his place and release him from his tortured wanderings. His story is pieced together by those who have glimpsed his eerie existence over the centuries, from a prisoner in the clutches of the Spanish Inquisition to a man incarcerated in a London lunatic asylum. Violent, elusive, profound, and blackly humorous, Melmoth the Wanderer was greatly admired by writers such as Balzac, Poe, Dostoevsky, and Oscar Wilde for its Baroque imagery and hallucinatory power. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not going to cover the plot line in this video. Per usual, I'm simply going to go pick out my favorite quotes. And the quotes that I've chosen, you don't really need the context for them to appreciate them. So I mean, if I'm going to give you the context of all these quotes, I might as well just read the whole book, and I'm not going to do that. So I think you can appreciate the quotations I'll give you without the context, and I'll give some of my ramblings aplenty whenever I present these quotations at times. And I do just want to say, with regard to this plot line, that it's something like I've never read before. I read this, oh my goodness, it's probably been 15 or 16 years ago. And I don't remember all the ins and outs of the plot line, but I do remember while I was reading it that it was very telescopic. If you can imagine a plot line, like you start somewhere, and then there's a story within that story, and then a story within that story, and then a story within that story, and a story within that story. Now, you would think, oh, that's very confusing, but it wasn't really. It was quite an interesting way to go with this story, and so you keep going telescopic in, and then at some point, as I recall, you start collapsing the telescope again to kind of getting back to where you started from. It's a very interesting narrative style, very unique. I've never encountered anything else like it. So that's one of the reasons why this book really stood out in my memory. Now, before we get started, I just want to say Sprite, zero sugar, they are bringing you this video. Oh no, they're not a sponsor. They're just bringing you this video because they're keeping my throat nice and clear, and just, keeping me refreshed. So in that sense, they're bringing you this video. But it is pretty good stuff. Alrighty. Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin. Quote, Numero uno. Now this is actually from the introduction. Whoever wrote the introduction, I could find out, but I'm not going to waste the time. Truth, and actually this is in the introduction, but it's a quote from the actual novel. Truth is told us by any mouth sooner than our own. Right? At times, that's very true. At times we are blind to our own faults. And it takes an objective point of view at times to point out what's wrong with us. This is also in the introduction. But hang on, I don't have that bookmarked to read, so never mind. Okay, chapter 1. When the mind is thus active in calling over invaders, no wonder the conquest is soon completed. This puts me in mind of the Bible verse. It's not verbatim, but like whenever we're led into sin by the desires of our own heart, right? We're tempted, and then whenever, like basically we invite our own mind invaders because we don't put up enough of a spiritual fight. We're not in prayer enough. We don't have accountability measures set up with another fellow believer. We don't have things in place. We don't have, whenever you don't have a proper defense, that's as good as an invitation. And beyond that, sometimes we truly do just seek out invaders to invade our soul and our mind. And when we do that, it's no wonder that the conquests of evil and distraction and loss of purpose are soon completed. There was nothing remarkable in the costume or in the countenance, but the eyes, John felt, were such as one feels they wish they had never seen, and feels they can never forget. Only the eyes had life. They gleamed with demon light. If you've ever seen an old photograph of Rasputin, right, the pretty much evil advisor to the last Tsar and his family of Russia, the Romanovs. If you've ever seen a picture of him, I think this description of only the eyes had life, they gleamed with demon light, but the eyes, John felt, were such as one feels they wish they had never seen, and feels they can never forget. It just, the whole aura is dark, except the eyes have a weird kind of, almost like a black light, luminescence behind them. Singular contrast. The relics of art are forever decaying, the production of nature forever renewed. It is an interesting contrast that, art is a recreation of man, right? Man can't really create anything. We can just repurpose, retool, make perhaps novel combinations. We mimic. Only God creates, but man can only, at best, recreate. And art is a recreation. It is a noble recreation. I believe that art can be a very noble enterprise, obviously. But as soon as it is created, it begins decaying. And it takes a lot of effort to slow down that decay. Whereas nature, it's ever renewing because God created nature. Yes, there is decay in nature, but even the decay within nature goes into the renewal, that cycle of death and renewal. And our man-made processes obviously can't do that. When one fierce passion is devouring the soul, we feel more than ever the necessity of external excitement, and our dependence on the world for temporary relief increases in direct proportion to our contempt of the world and all its works. Wow. I have 2 stars by this quote. I underlined it, and then I liked it so much I put a star on either side, one on each side of the margin. When one fierce passion is devouring the soul, you're like monomaniacal, basically. We feel more than ever the necessity of external excitement, right? Basically to overcompensate for our vapidness. And our dependence on the world for temporary relief increases, right? Our reliance upon the pleasures of the flesh and the eyes and the pride of life. These reliances increase in direct proportion to our contempt of the world and all its works. I mean, think of the housewives of wherever, that reality TV show. Now, that's not a good example. I haven't really watched a lot of those. I only know it by stereotype, and so I don't think that's fair to really... I think I'd be pretty safe. However, I'm not going to use that as an example because it wouldn't be completely fair, because I only know it by stereotype. But think of just somebody who's just, they hate the world, but yet they rely on the world to sustain their purpose. I think we could all think of a person or people like that, or even recall a time in our life when we were also like that. Are those celestial sounds that seem to prepare us for heaven only intended to announce the presence of an incarnate fiend who mocks the devoted with airs from heaven while he prepares to surround them with blasts from hell? Curiosity is in one respect like love. It always compromises between the object and the feeling, and provided the latter possesses sufficient energy, no matter how contemptible the former may be. A time will come, and soon, when from mere habit you will echo the scream of every delirious wretch that harbors near you. Then you will pause, clasp your hands on your throbbing head, and listen with horrible anxiety whether the scream proceeded from you or them. The time will come when, from the want of occupation, the listless and horrible vacancy of your hours, you will feel as anxious to hear those shrieks as you were at first terrified to hear them. You will watch for the ravings of your next neighbor as you would for a scene on the stage. All humanity will be extinguished in you. The ravings of these wretches will become at once your sport and your torture. I think this brought to mind the adage, an idle mind is the devil's playground. Also, idle hands are the devil's playground, right? It kind of has the sense of like a voyeur, not necessarily in the sexual sense, but just in the sense of like the perpetual observer, the perpetual person who doesn't interact. They just simply observe. And of course, this is very should be convicting of our own culture, where we kind of enjoy and we get entertainment from the misfortunes of others. And the German has a perfect word for that, Schadenfreude. There is no perfect English equivalent for that, but Schadenfreude is the pleasure gleaned from others' misfortunes. I mean, it's a terrible pleasure. However, I think we've all had that experience, and we've all engaged in Schadenfreude from time to time. Leave it to the Germans to come up with a word like that. Schadenfreude. Oh, Schadenfreude. Ich bin eine Schweinhuhn. Look that one up. Alrighty. This is a paragraph that Melmoth, kind of a monologue where he's critiquing the Christian monastic life. The brethren always assumed before me an air of tranquility that eulogized their situation more powerfully than the most exaggerated eloquence. The petty squabbles and intrigues of the convent, the bitter and incessant conflicts of habits, tempers, and interests, the efforts of incarcerated minds for objects of excitement, the struggles to diversify endless monotony and elevate hopeless mediocrity. All that makes monastic life like the wrong side of tapestry, where we see only uncouth threads and the harsh outlines, without the glow of the colors, the richness of the tissue, or the splendor of the embroidery that renders the external surface so rich and dazzling. All this was carefully concealed. I heard something of it, however, and, young as I was, could not help wondering how men who carried the worst passions of life into their retreat could imagine that retreat was a refuge from the erosions of their evil tempers, the monitions of conscience, and the accusations of God. The same dissimulation was practiced by the boarders. The whole house was in masquerade from the moment I entered it. Oop, wrong way. Forgot to turn on my light. Personally, I'm not against monasticism in and of itself. I'm unaware of any kind of monastic order within Protestantism. Of course, the Catholics have different orders, and I admire it in a sense. I think that it is worthwhile for some people, and it is a valid calling for some people to take monastic orders. However, I the deeply embedded monk who lives life by these like extra biblical orders. I mean that is legalism, even though it may be on the even though it may be on the far side of salvation, or even though it may be on this side of salvation. Like maybe it's not legalism associated with salvation, but you can still have legalism associated with what is considered the holy life, or what is considered sanctification after salvation. So I think we got to be careful with legalism on both accounts, both with soteriology, that pertaining to salvation, and also with sanctification, that dealing with trying to live the life of the holy life and a life of obedience after salvation. You can have legalism at both points, and I think it's dangerous. I mean, I went to a conservative liberal arts Christian university, and now I don't want to blame their rules, because it was my choice. I rebelled big time, especially during my last 2 years at this Christian university. And so I don't want to put the onus on them. It's 100% on me. However, I do recognize that part of what got me to the point of rebelling was the extra biblical, the strict rules at that school. Now, I'm not against rules. I mean, we gotta, they're even within civil life, like just as a citizen, the government has rules that are extra biblical, that are good. So it's okay to have rules, but it was just difficult, because they were trying to protect us from ourselves, but it seemed quite legalistic at times, and I did not really appreciate that. Let me give an example. Yeah, you could wear sandals. You had to wear socks with your sandals. You had to wear socks with your sandals. And you had to wear a collared shirt. I mean, this was during class time. This was the class, and this was on the academic side of campus. And I remember at the beginning of one school year, I was in the student center going down the main stairs, and I encountered the dean of students, and he knew me by name, and he said, I see you're wearing you don't have socks on with your sandals. I was like, oh yeah, I just didn't even think about it. I totally didn't even think about it. I'm sorry. He's like, oh, that's okay. I mean, he let me go. He didn't give me a demerit, but it was demeritable. And that's just nuts. I mean, that's nuts. Like, I mean, you can't, it's just a false sense of modesty is what they're trying to enforce there. And that's legalism. And I don't appreciate that. So we have to be careful with that. There's definitely, within Christian communities, within any kind of like religious community, even within the true faith of Christianity, we have to be careful with a masquerade of piety, a masquerade of righteousness. Yeah, we all want to put our best foot forward, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we can do that at the same time, and we can be honest, and we can be real with one another about what our struggles are, and what our struggles have been, and our hopes and our dreams. So just, you can be real while still pursuing a goal that you know that you'll never reach this side of heaven. Pleasure is very selfish. And when selfishness pleads to selfishness for relief, it is like a bankrupt asking his fellow prisoner to go bail for him. I reflected that a taste for pleasure, while it renders a man selfish in one sense, renders him generous in another. The real voluptuary, though, he would not part with his slightest indulgence to save the world from destruction, would yet wish all the world to be enjoying itself, provided it was not at his expense, because his own would be increased by it. Now, I don't think that pleasure in itself is selfish. I think that there's a good argument that God wants us to have pleasure in this life, right? We should not have our life should not be consumed by pleasure. That should not be our highest, or even among our highest priorities, just like happiness, right? We should not be pursuing happiness per se. In the same way, we should not be pursuing pleasure per se as an end. But it's not selfish whenever we do take time to have pleasure, whatever that may be, as long as it's not sinful in nature. But I do think there's some insight here that, some people, they would not give up their slightest indulgence, even to save the world from destruction. But at the same time, they would rather have everybody else enjoying themselves. Because what good is a party of one? If you're partying but the whole rest of the world is starving, you at least want some friends to party with, thereby to increase your pleasure. Not for their sakes, but just so their good time will enhance your good time. So I think there's some insight there into some of the motives of certain people. I had something to hope, and that is often better than something to enjoy. The cup of hope always excites thirst. That of fruition disappoints or quenches it. That's kind of a good perspective. But oh, how false a treaty made with God, which we ratify with our own blood. When he has declared there is but one sacrifice he will accept, even that of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. It's quite insightful as well. How false a treaty made with God, which we ratify with our own blood. This reminds me of the verse, God prefers obedience more than sacrifice. If we are trying to offer our own blood in the treaty with God, if we're trying to sacrifice ourself or things, that can be good, but that's not the real point. That's not what God really wants. He wants obedience, no matter what that obedience, no matter how that obedience is fleshed out or manifests itself. Sometimes that may be a sacrifice, but the true sacrifice of blood is Jesus Christ, and that's what it mentions here, and that's the only one that really counts, because that is God himself contracting with God himself. Therefore, it's an eternal union. It's a true treaty, ratified with God's own blood. Driven to extremity myself, I felt a kind of pride in driving others to it in return. Anything of violent excitement, of rapid and giddy vicissitude, or even of intense suffering, I was prepared for and equal to, at that moment, but these paroxysms soon exhaust themselves and us by their violence. Men of the world command us by their passions, and men of the other world by the apparent suppression of them. Men of the world being the sinful world command us by their passions, and then men of the other world, I take that to mean men of the cloth, like pastors and men of God, basically. They command us by the apparent suppression of our passions, at least in the way they manifest sinfully. God can use our passions. He can repurpose our passions for His glory and for our good. But I don't think that's the context here. The moment of life is put beyond the reach of your will. Let me start again. The moment life is put beyond the reach of your will and placed under the influence of mechanical operations, it becomes, to thinking beings, a torment insupportable. And this sounds like prison, right? The moment life is put beyond the reach of your will and placed under the influence of mechanical operations, it becomes, to thinking beings, to humans, most humans, a torment insupportable. Prison is so rigid. It's I think that's the hell of prison, is just not being able to do something small that you'd like to do and having to submit to that rigid structure every day. Do what the guards tell you to do. I mean, I don't even think you can sleep in prison. That would be the worst part. I mean, prison, prison would be mitigated in my mind if you could just sleep your life away. But you can't do that. That's the terrible part of prison. The repetition of religious duties without the feeling or spirit of religion produces an incurable callousity of heart. There are not more irreligious people to be found on earth than those who are occupied always by its externals. Certainly, we saw this with the Pharisees. Like whenever Jesus put down the Pharisees, and for giving long-winded and like prayers only to be heard by the crowd. They weren't sincere prayers. They weren't intended for God's ears. They were intended just to be heard by the crowd, only for the externals, only so that people would say, "Wow, look how righteous they are." Not, "Wow, look how amazing God is." Now, having said this, I think we also need to be careful not to avoid things just for fear that something could become repetitive. I go to a church. I love my church. I love it very much. I go to a church, and for my whole life, they do communion. They take the Lord's Supper quarterly. They do it 4 times a year. And I know it's been communicated that the thinking behind this is they only do it 4 times a year because they don't want it to become just a rote thing that we do, and it thereby lose its meaning and its intensity. And I understand that. I understand that justification. But at the same time, I don't think that justification is justification enough. Because if something is worth doing, and the communion is very important, it's a sacrament given by God, it's an ordinance given by God. And it connects us to God in a very important way, not only to God, but it also connects us to our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. You know, the Bible says every time we take communion, we what's the verb? We basically we preach the gospel. We remind ourselves of we proclaim the gospel to each other within the communion ordinance. And so why would we limit ourselves to doing that only 4 times a year? Somebody once said that, you know, do you only tell your wife you love her 4 times a year because you don't want it to lose its meaning? No, I tell my wife I love her multiple times every single day. Like I'm that kind of guy. I tell my wife and my son I love them multiple times every single day. And I say it because it's an instinct. Because I do truly love them, it just bubbles up and I have to tell them. I'm not telling them because out of unfeeling, out of just repetition. It is repetitious, but it doesn't lack feeling due to that reason. And in the same way, I think that we ought to take communion just because it's something we do, because it just bubbles up naturally within our spirits because of what God has done for us and what communion itself represents that God has done for us. And so doing it 4 times a year just for the fear that it may become repetitious and lose its heart is not good enough of a reason. I mean, we with our church service, we kind of have the same format every service. You know, we have prayers at the same time during every church service. We sing the same song at the closing of every service. Why are we doing that? Why is there no fear of losing the meaning with that? So I don't think it's good. It's not an issue that I'm going to break off with the church about, but I just wish that we would do it every Sunday. I think communion is very important and that we should do it every Sunday. Next quote. I tried to reflect, to feel. Both efforts failed. And perhaps it is in this silence of the soul, this suspension of all the clamorous voices of the passions, that we are most ready to hear the voice of God. You know, there was a moment, there's a few moments in life that you just remember them, you can remember them forever, as if you were there. And you just recognize them as moments of having that silence of the soul, and that everything is in harmony in that moment, and that if you died, you're totally ready to go. Like if you died in that moment, you're ready. Like, just take me now, Lord, I'm ready. One of those moments. And there was a moment that I will never forget. I was on a mission trip in Equatorial Guinea. It's a small nation on the west coast of Africa. And it was my first time out of North America. And wow, what a way to go. I mean, it was definitely an eye opener. I loved it. It was my real first hook into international travel. And I was on I was in this bush taxi. It was a small van. I was sitting next to this African lady, and she had chickens. She had brought a couple chickens on the bush taxi with her. One was down at our feet, and I gotta tell you, I like to eat chicken, but chickens, the animals, they kind of just weird me out. I'm not real comfortable with them around. I don't know what it is. I would never be one to just go up and hold a chicken in my arms. Like if they're about my feet, okay. If they're like approaching me, like a happy dog. Oh man, nah, I'm gonna be a little bit. I'm gonna be a little, little skittish there. I don't know. One of my weird, many idiosyncrasies. But anyways, in that moment, I was so content and so at peace, even with the chickens. Just looking out, like just being there where I was on this bush taxi on this dirt road in the middle of nowhere in Africa. And there was this aroma of the sweat of palm wine drinkers. Palm wine is this really interesting liquor in West Africa. They make it out of like the sap of palm trees, and whenever people drink that, and it's hot, obviously, in Africa, so their skin obviously has it has a glisten regularly, and this palm wine that they drink, whenever they sweat, it exudes. You basically smell the palm wine coming through their skin when they sweat, and it's just very. It's kind of It's kind of an intoxicating smell. It's very interesting. I wouldn't call it pleasant. I wouldn't call it disgusting. It's just interesting. And all this going on around me, I just had one of those moments, those silences of the soul, where I was like, I'm in Africa now. I could die and I would be happy. I was just one of those moments. Those who by their vows are excluded from the interests which natural affections give us in life must seek for it in the artificial ones of pride and domination. And to me, this speaks of the problem of celibacy of Catholic priests. Why? As a Protestant, I'm very sympathetic with the Catholic Church. I admire the Catholic Church. I find commonalities with the Catholic Church more than probably most Protestants would. But this is one of those things that, I would never be able to become a Catholic, and this is one of them. Why must they take vows of celibacy? Why must they take a vow that excludes them from the interests which natural affection gives them and leads them, kind of tempts them more into pride and domination? Now, I understand that Paul, by all accounts, was single, at least once he had gone on his Christian, once he had become a Christian. He was single, and many of the early apostles, at least we believe, were single. But that in no way, there's no injunction, there's no command in the Bible that a preacher or a priest, I don't even know why they call them priests, that a pastor would be that needs to be celibate. There's no reason for that. Maybe the argument is that so they can fully dedicate their lives to God and not have the distractions. But you could also make the argument that family life increases your insights and increases your ability to minister to your flock. I think that's a better argument, actually. Joy is a convulsion, but grief is a habit. And to describe what we never can communicate is as absurd as to talk of colors to the blind. I will hasten on, not to tell of my feelings, but of the results which they produced. We see a lot of outrage in culture now, a lot of hurt feelings, and a person isn't right or wrong by the feelings that they have, or by the feelings that they invoke in others by the expression of their opinions. we can't really communicate well emotions or our feelings. They're too subjective. But what we can communicate are the results which they produce. We can communicate our thoughts, our thinking, our ideas. And that's why reasonable debate, an argument, is so valuable. And public discourse, respectful public discourse, is so valuable. Because if we're just going off emotions, there's nothing can ever really be said. Nothing is ever really communicated. We become animalistic. It's all growls and shrieks and whatever other kind of animalistic onomatopoeia you can think of. I was prepared for death, but something worse than death appeared, threatened in these preparations. When we are driven to the precipice of mortality, we spring forward with resolution, and often defeat the triumph of our murderers by merging it with our own. But when we are led to it step by step, held often over it, and then withdrawn, we lose our resolution along with our patience, and feel that the last blow would be mercy, compared with its long suspended, slowly descending, wavering, mutilating, hesitating stroke. Right? If you're gonna kill me, just do it already. Right? Don't prolong the suffering. Just make it a clean cut, like a merciful death. Just because a merciful death in the old days was a quick one. It was a good executioner was one who could make it quick. That's where the French word from French coup de grace comes from. Coup de grace means the stroke of grace. Actually, grace is grace. Coup is stroke or strike. So the strike of grace. We often translate it into death stroke, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's actually just it's the death stroke of grace to just put you out of your misery. Mercy killing, basically. Misery always breaks down the mind into petty details. We have not strength to comprehend the whole of our calamity. We feel not the mountain which is heaped on us, but the nearest grains press on and grind us. Yep. It's the little things that kill, right? It's a quotation from a Bush song for all you 90s folks out there. When all the world seems sworn to hostility against us, we turn friends to ourselves with all the obstinacy of despair. And while all the world is flattering and deifying us, we are the perpetual victims of lassitude and self-reproach. When everybody's against us, we just become friends with ourselves. Me, myself, and I, bestest of friends. But whenever the world is flattering and raising us up and deifying us, we reproach ourselves. We are our own worst enemies. Quite a paradox there. I think it is better to be mad at once than to believe that all the world is sworn to think and make you be so, in spite of your own consciousness of your sanity. I empathize with this sentiment, but I wholeheartedly disagree. Right? It's better to be mad. It's better just to really be crazy just be crazy, than to believe that but it's better to just be, he's saying it's better to just be crazy than to have the world consider you crazy, but you know that you're not. But I disagree with that. I think, I mean, it is hard, certainly very, very hard and depressing whenever you know that you're right, like you're the lone sane person in the room. It is difficult. It is trying. But it is better than being actually crazy. It is better than joining the lunatics. Even though they may be having more fun, it is better to remain the sane one. It is not easy to pass from extreme humiliation and utter abhorrence to your former state in the society of which you are a member. Right? Whenever you've been so humiliated and so utterly dejected by your community, it's really hard to have the patience and the fortitude to allow yourself to get back into good standing within your community. No matter what community that may be, no matter what scale that may be. Once somebody falls, it's easier just to stay down and to make a home of your new place of degradation and your new, once you're in the doghouse, it's easier just sometimes to stay in the doghouse than to try to do all the things necessary, the rigmarole of society, at least so perceived, to get back to where you're in good standing. A consciousness of our superiority is often more delightful when confined to our own breasts than when expressed by others. I'll just remain silent on that one. His soul must be saturated with avarice, sensuality, and desperation. There is nothing he will hesitate at if he be bribed. For money he will undertake your liberation. For money he will undertake to strangle you in your cell. He envies Judas the 30 pieces of silver for which the Redeemer of mankind was sold. His soul might be purchased at half price. He is the instrument with which I must work. It is horrible, but necessary. I have read that from the most venomous reptiles and plants have been extracted the most sanative medicines. I will squeeze the juice and trample on the weed. Sometimes we are in situations, I think, where, sometimes there's that expression, choose the worst, or, choose the lesser of two evils. And I've always taken issue with that, because if we must choose the worst of, if we must choose the least of two evils, well, then let's choose neither one. Let's not choose either one. If they both are truly evil, and one's a little bit better than the other, or less evil than the other, let's choose neither one. But in my age, I realize that sometimes that is not exactly the best, honestly. I think sometimes you do have to work with people that you would never choose to, but that you don't have a choice in the matter. And that sometimes it's, it is better to work with somebody that you would prefer not to than to not work with them at all, than to not work with anybody. I mean, think about voting for president. Okay, I think it is good for everybody, for Christians, to vote. I think that voting is the way our government has been set up, and since that is the way our government has been set up for our leaders to get to where they need to be, then that means that God uses the voting process to appoint leaders, right? Because God is the one who ultimately appoints the leaders. Like we have a say in it through voting, but ultimately, in the grand scheme and the big picture of things, it is God that appoints leaders. And it just so happens that God uses the elections to do that in this country, at least for elected officials. And with that, especially in the presidency, because it usually just comes down to two not ideal candidates. In that sense, I think it is sometimes better to choose the lesser of two evils than to not vote. Now, that having been said, there was an election where I did not vote for either candidate because I could not really vote for either one in good conscience. But upon reflection, perhaps I should have voted for the one that I considered the lesser of two evils at the time. So there is merit to that quote, to the ideas there. Alrighty. How is it that crime thus seizes us in life with a fearless grasp, while the touch of conscience trembles on the verge of our garment? Right? Whenever we are tempted to do something bad, we are seized by it. We are seized by that temptation to where, like, we can't think of anything else until we have satiated our desire to perpetuate that sin. However, conscience, right? The Holy Spirit whispers. He whispers. Our conscience trembles on the verge of our garment. It is a paradox. That's why as Christians we need to be sensitive. We need to be living a holy life and resisting temptation so that the connection, that line of communication between us and God is crystal clear, so that when we're whispered to by the Holy Spirit, we can hear it, and there's no static on the line. I was a maniac, oscillating between hope and despair. I seemed to myself all that day to be pulling the rope of a bell, whose alternating knell was heaven, hell. I think we've all been in situations where that seemed the case. Alrighty, I'm going to stop this. I'm about halfway through with Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Maturin. I will continue again next week, and we'll get this one done in 2 videos. And I hope you enjoyed that. These quotes from Melmoth the Wanderer. My wife, I hear her getting home now, so good timing. And remember, Sprite, 0 sugar. Good stuff. It does not have that diet aftertaste. That's one of the reasons why I enjoy it so much. So, I hope you join us next time. Like, subscribe, share. If this is content that you enjoy, I hope that you've been encouraged by this stuff. All right. Peregrine Prude, out.